What's up, everyone? I recently had the pleasure to catch up with Matt McManus and have a brief conversation about his latest book, The Emergence of Postmodernity at the Intersection of Liberalism, Capitalism, and Secularism, and his first killer article for Commonweal magazine on Alexander Dugin entitled Just Call It Fascism. Even though our conversation was cut short since Matt had to go on Ben Burge's show, we did manage to cover a fair amount of ground and details of his latest book that I was hoping to touch upon, especially in light of my recent conversation with Galen Watts, Matteo Bortolini, and Sean McGrath. In any event, I hope you all enjoy our conversation, and being that I started a new Substack project on some of these themes and subjects, I might do a brief commentary and weave in some of this conversation into this week's posts. Obviously, time permitting, and how I feel going into this weekend. So make sure to check out the references and links. Peace. Until then. Sweet. Well, it's good to see you, man.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. How's things in Montreal right now? Yeah, ever since I left Canada, all kinds of weird shit's happened, given like the universal strike that seems to be breaking out in Ontario and the ongoing stuff about COVID.
So far, so good. I mean, winter has arrived, though. We can start to really feel it in terms of some snow on the ground already, and the seasons is changing pretty quick.
Yeah, I remember I took a train from Toronto to Montreal back in 2017. And it was a balmy -5 in Toronto around like December 1st. And the minute I got to Montreal, it was like -25 and it felt like -35. And I walked outside and I was just like, I'm not prepared for this mentally, spiritually, or on any kind of fucking level. You know what I mean? -25 with wind chill is not human weather.
No, man, especially from your move from Mexico. I mean, you spent over a year, I guess, in Mexico?
2 years. Yeah.
2 years. So yeah, that's going to be pretty drastic in terms of temperature change there for you. And now in Michigan, that can't be that much better either.
No, not really. I mean, the weird thing is because we're between so many Great Lakes now, the big thing that's different is it rains an awful lot here. But you know, I gotta say, the town itself is really nice. Do you follow college football at all?
Yeah, man, I'm a big Michigan Wolverine fan. Well, growing up in college football, I mean, it's pretty wild. I was going to say, if you hit up a game yet, it's going to be wild.
I haven't. I haven't been able to afford it. You know, maybe in a couple months' time. I looked into it when I first moved here, and I was like, $300 for me and my wife. That's after moving and all that stuff. It's a little too pricey. But yeah, I mean, I did go down to the bar for the U Michigan and Michigan State game, which was huge, right? And I had no idea what college sports really meant coming from Carleton or York, because when I was there, there were just hundreds of thousands of people like all sequestered into the downtown, and there were fights that were breaking out and everybody was cheering. It was cool though. I mean, I got off on the energy and there was something exciting about it. So yeah, it's nice.
And well, I saw you post some photos as well. I mean, participate in some of the kind of political type stuff. You saw Bernie Sanders speak.
I did, yeah. I mean, that's actually where I think I got COVID, so maybe it wasn't the best idea.
No way.
But I decided to roll the dice on that because I was like, well, you know, I've never seen the guy live. It was fun though. I mean, there were probably about. The room was packed, and I think they said they had a capacity of something like 1,000 or whatever it is. So there were a lot of people that showed up. It was the midterms. The crowd was really gunning for him. He had 3 stops to make that day, and we were number 2, and then he had to fly on to Philadelphia. So I could tell that he was saving at least a little bit of his energy for the last rally. But you know, to be fair, at whatever he is, you know, I think it's 80, 81, you know, with 3 stops across the country a day. You can't really blame him for that.
That's pretty wild. At their age too. I mean, I'm still like, I'm freaking out about Biden's age, and seeing him go as well is just wild.
Oh, I know, right? I mean, the rumors around the world right now are, of course, whether or not he's going to be running again. I was just chatting about that with my buddies when I went back to Toronto the other weekend. Just find it so hard. Like, I mean, not even just because you have to ask yourself, will he do it? Or would he do it? But why would he want to do it? Because I mean, imagine being 83 and being told, like, great, you're gonna have to keep pulling 12-hour days for the next 4 years. And this isn't a low responsibility job. If you fuck up, people's lives are in your hands, maybe everybody's lives. 83, I'd be like, no, I'm retiring.
And he has a heart condition. He's already been operated on, if I understand correctly, I think at one point or another.
Yeah, I read about that. And, 83 is when you, like, 83, is when you want to go write your memoirs. You know what I mean? Or better yet, hire someone to ghostwrite your memoirs for you while you sit there with, an iced tea and scotch, swirling it around, and just like, so what you're going to do is follow me around, hear my thoughts, and take that and translate that into glittering prose, something like that, right?
Yeah. No, it's wild. I mean, it's no, I find it uninspiring at a certain level as well. I think there needs to be some younger blood in there. But I mean, I see quite a lot of enthusiasm of people out there that are hoping that maybe Bernie's got some wind left in his sails, or.
Well, I love Bernie Sanders. I supported him in the last two the last two electoral cycles. I do think that somebody else should take his place. I think that both for his sake and for the movement's sake, we need somebody who's not an octogenarian running the show. Then again, that's not a slack at him. Like I said, I went to go see him. He's still got a lot of fire in his belly. He was really enthusiastic. And I will say he's probably been more pronounced on things like abortion rights than almost any other U.S. politician I can think of, with the exception of AOC and a few other members of the squad. So good on him. I mean, he's done a tremendous amount to shift political culture in this country, and I'm forever grateful for that.
Yeah. No doubt. I mean, he's very inspiring, and I mean, I can't think of anybody else that I would like to see with his energy and his outlook and stuff like that on, in terms of how he sees things. I just haven't seen somebody being able to go out and fill his shoes up to this date. So, I mean, it's something to watch for sure.
Definitely. I mean, it is kind of the drag about political leadership, which is that no matter how effective a movement you build, if you have a charismatic leader at the helm, there's always a risk that when he or she is gone, you're going to lose an awful lot of momentum. And sometimes it's going to have real tragic implications. I mean, think about 1968 when MLK was shot, right? On my birthday, April 4th of all things. I mean, there were an abundance of talented people in the civil rights movement. And the movement itself was extremely intellectually diverse. So it's not like it couldn't or didn't carry forward. But I don't think anybody would deny that it lost a certain amount of momentum and hope when he was gone. And I think that's just because, to a certain extent, he was irreplaceable as a kind of charismatic source of inspiration. And I'd say something similar about Bernie now.
Yeah.
But hopefully I'm wrong.
Totally
maybe somebody will come up.
For sure. No. But yeah, man, I finished your book finally. And well, one, I was super excited to pick it up. I mean, I've been wanting to get around to it for a while, because when I saw that you were going to be writing on secularism, I mean, I knew I need to get around to it eventually. And I'm even more excited now, coming off a conversation with Galen Watts and Matteo Bortolini, in terms of around Robert Bella's work. And I guess maybe that'd be my first question to you is, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Robert Bella's work.
I'm not, except through Galen. And I should say Galen's book on secularization theory, criticizing secularization theory, is fantastic. And it was kind of an indirect inspiration on some of the later things that I wrote, because I only got my hands on it in very early 2022 when I was making a few amendments. But when I went back to tinker with the material, I definitely had his text in mind. But I think this notion that under postmodern conditions that Watts puts forward, what we see isn't so much the advent of pure secularization or the complete desacralization of the world, the way that Weber suggested, but instead to transition to a kind of religion of the heart, as the term he uses, that's tied to expressive individualism, is a fascinating thesis. And he does a really good job of backing that up empirically, admittedly with a relatively small number of case studies in Toronto. And if anyone spent any time in Toronto, you'll know that expressive individualism is pretty much the operative philosophy that almost is in the air you breathe, right? So I'm not sure how widely applied these kinds of results can be or would be, but it's a fascinating book, and I really endorse everyone taking a look at it when they get the chance.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it too, and I mean, through his work, I mean, he was, you can see that he's spent a lot of time with Robert Bella, and Robert Bella's had a tremendous impact on my thinking, mostly in the field of sociology and religious studies. But he touches a lot upon this idea of modernization theory and multiple modernities in his work and stuff like that. So to see him, kind of weave that in and out of his work is, I mean, it was just a huge honor for me to sit down with him and pick his brains. And obviously the fact that he's a student with Will Kimalika as well, which is pretty cool. I mean, Will is a towering figure up in Canada. So to be able to sit down with, with Galen and get a bit of a feel, in terms of how that influences thinking as well was pretty cool. And he opened up, I mean, really the possibility for me to go out and interview Matteo Bertolini, who's Robert Bella's kind of authorized biographer. And for me to be able to, kind of sit down with him and have that conversation following the conversation with Galen, I mean, it was amazing. So I was flying high. And then when I fell into your work, I was like, well, I wanted to go and read your book for a while, but after coming off those conversations, I was like, oh, I got to do it now. Try and get Matt to come back on and go out and talk about some stuff in terms of his book, because your book, I mean, there's so many sections in here that I want to go out and talk to you about. But the main one that really stuck out for me is obviously, the section basically on the roots of postmodernity and secularization, where you go through like a tremendous amount of interesting stuff there. But the section that really hit home, or I'm pretty excited to talk to you about, is this section in terms of rethinking religion in postmodern era. Towards a Christian dialectical materialism of Slavoj Zizek and Martin, how do I pronounce his last name?
Haglund.
Thank you.
That's just my best crack at it also, since I am not from any Nordic country.
Okay. So obviously I'd like to frame the conversation a bit around that, but I wanted to, because this is like your 7th book, man, right? Or 7th book project that you've been involved in now.
I often say that I am simultaneously a good testament to the power of neoliberalism and simultaneously a critic of neoliberalism, a living criticism of neoliberalism, because I've worked pretty hard to try to compete in a very kind of competitive atmosphere. But at the same time, partially because of those experiences, I should say that I don't think anybody should have to do that in order to get a reasonably good academic career. I think it's unfair, and it's also imposing just a tremendous amount of psychological burdens on all kinds of my colleagues, right? So
no doubt. Yeah, I could only imagine the stress and strain to go and pump this kind of material out. I mean, your productivity is amazing to me, but I mean, and also, I mean, like in your introduction and obviously Victor's introduction, I want to get you maybe to just kind of spell out or kind of reflect back, because this has been a 10-year project for you, really, almost, or more than that, in terms of talking about postmodernism and postmodern conservatism. And Victor's introduction really hit home for me in a certain way to reflect back on the historical kind of craziness that we're living through. So I was kind of curious, now that this thing is out of you, out in the little world, like how do you feel about the book now? And, what are you thinking about in terms of, reflecting back on it?
Well, personally, I think it's the best book that I've written. And that's just grading on a curve, right? I remember Kurt Vonnegut once decided to play university professor to his own bibliography, and he graded each one of his books, from A+ to F. And he actually gave a couple of his books an F, which is a brutal thing to do. But, looking back on everything that I've read, it's the one that I'm most happy with. And actually, that was an unusual experience when I recognized that after completing it, because I realized I have published a few other things before, and some of them I'm happy with looking back. Other things, I sit there and I'm like, if I could go back and rewrite that, I really would. Particularly one of my books, A Critical Legal Examination of Liberalism and Liberal Rights, that came out in 2020. I wrote that near the end of the pandemic, and I was or the beginning of the pandemic, excuse me. And I was just in a sour mood, like a really, really bad mood. And it really came through in the text. Whereas the emergence of postmodernity, I was in a more relaxed situation. it also helped that we were just knee deep in the pandemic at that point, so I had nothing else to do but work on it, right? Uh, and watch copious amounts of Netflix. So it came out more or less the way that I'd conceived. Now, this doesn't mean that I maybe won't write something better in the future. I hope to. It'd be kind of sad if I thought that was my last word on things. But yeah, I'm pretty pleased with how things turned out. Just
Yeah, no,
grading on my
and
own.
like compared to all the other book. Well, I mean, it's not, there's some sections in the book. Obviously, if you've read some of your other material, uh, is not necessarily new in terms of your overall thinking, but you've definitely refined it down to a T, and you elaborate in some, fantastic ways in there in terms of
Thanks.
the book itself. But I guess the first thing, well, one, this is the other thing too. You get away with some jokes in here, man. I'm wondering how you were able to kind of slide through some of these sections in here through the editor, because I was reading through some of the sections on Spivak and some stuff on postmodernism as well. Like you're laying in some pretty funny digs in there, and it's an academic press. So how did that
Honestly,
come about? Her?
There are two things. One is I spent a lot of time reading Terry Eagleton's work in preparation for this book.
Okay.
Because Terry Eagleton is a very good Marxist critic of postmodernity and postmodernism generally. And what I was really impressed by stylistically was the way that he was able to be academically rigorous without being, frankly, kind of boring, and also bringing a real kind of levity to some of the material that didn't undercut the seriousness of what he was saying, but actually complemented it, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So that was a big thing, what I was reading from a left perspective. One of the other things that's a kind of little bit more amusing is that I was spending a lot of time reading conservative authors also, as I always do, right? And the conservative intellectual tradition is far more prone to this kind of irreverent and sardonic kind of approach to material than what you find with left-wing authors, where the left tends to bring a level of righteousness and, what's the way to put it, kind of principled magnanimity to any kind of writing that it produces. So I think that kind of influenced it also. And I guess the third thing was honestly just having written a few books by now, I just felt a little bit more confident to express more sides of my personality, right? Like, it's...
Now that you're bringing up Eagleton, I can see that kind of, because I love Eagleton's work as well, and he makes some pretty funny digs at times, and he's pretty witty in terms of how he goes out and does his takedowns of some of his opponents, intellectual sort of opponents and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so a kind of a combination of reading that material, maybe to excess, frankly, and just feeling more confident and being in a better mental space than some of my other books. I just felt, happier with expressing those kinds of side to me. It's odd that you mentioned that, because a few people have mentioned that my more recent writing has been funnier, is the way they put it. And I'm not a comedian or anything like that, but I've always thought like I've had. I like to laugh at the very least, you know what I mean? So I was like, well, that's good. At least it's a different side of my personality that's reflecting in my writing. Now I'm not a fiction author, so it's not the most.
I had some great chuckles. I mean, and I even sent you some kind of stuff that I posted to Twitter or through Twitter to you and stuff like that, where I was having some good laughs. And another one too, that, like it kind of hits home, almost close to home, is your kind of takedown of, these so-called metamodernity or metamodernism and stuff like that. And you're quite critical of that, of, and you make this kind of sly joke of, if we go out and put in metamodern in front of anything, like somehow going to get us out of postmodernity and stuff like that. So I was hoping to hear you kind of elaborate a bit, of your critique around that. I mean, you take down actually Badiou around that, but I mean, part of the larger kind of online discourse and stuff like that, my interest in stuff around integral theory coalesces quite well, or merges into this so-called metamodernity or metamodernism sort of term that's spinning around on the internet and stuff like that. And your critique of it, I think, is dead on. But I want to hear you kind of talk a bit about it on the pod, because I think a lot of my listeners are going to be interested to go out and hear, your critique of that and the reason why you kind of stay far away from it and stuff like that.
Well, I think part of the reason why I made fun of a lot of those kinds of terminologies and rhetorics, and that is the way that I would understand them, is that what they've tended to do consistently has been to think that by reframing the cultural conditions in which we inhabit in a very slightly different way, and then giving it a neologism, then somehow they're engaging in very robustly critical work. Now, I'm not wed to the term postmodernity. I kind of was pointing out this lexicon to almost mention the fact that it's kind of a happenstance that things are called postmodernity, or we're said that we lived in a postmodern moment, right? But what I really wanted to impress upon people is that what we should be less focused on is a kind of academic faddishness of trying to say the next new thing, and spend a little bit more time analyzing the dialectical dimensions of the cultural condition in which we live, and recognizing that it has both positive and negative aspects for emancipatory politics going forward.
No, for sure. No, totally. And I mean, well, because I mean, even some people, and even more kind of academic type circles, I mean, they're, like the talk about post-modernity, or that somehow, like through the cultural condition, something is just going to go naturally emerge out of it. But your critique is, you obviously take a very left-wing sort of takedown of that idea, is that without, big time material changes, that's never going to go out and happen. So your critique in terms of to go out and even talk about cultural conditions to go out and really change is that your remedy is basically liberal socialism. And I mean, personally, I mean, I fell prey to that sort of worldview, like I just thought naturally that this sort of element of progress is going to go out and happen naturally. Through culture rather than through, necessarily material conditions and stuff like that to go out and critique. And that's really what Michael Brooks was doing as well. And so I guess, because you have a new book coming out on Michael Brooks. So, I mean, how much were you thinking about that kind of, this idea of cosmopolitan socialism in light of while you were going out and writing this book at the same time? Or, how were you, sitting with that, writing this particular book?
Well, Michael's influence was pervasive throughout, I should say, right? In particular, his rare ability to interrogate spiritual subject matters with respect and depth from a left-wing perspective. That was extremely influential to me. In particular, the chapters you mentioned on secularization theory owe a great deal to the spirit of Michael's kind of approach to these kinds of subject matters. But just to kind of stick with Brooks for a second, what I wanted to kind of demonstrate is that there is a spiritual malaise that underpins postmodernity. And the way to kind of overcome this spiritual malaise is paradoxically not simply through a shift in our religious or spiritual convictions. And this is, again, where I draw very much on the materialist Christianity of people like Hagelin and Zizek, or for that matter, the liberation theology tradition, where there's a consistent emphasis on spiritual transformations through acts and deeds, and transformations in our moral relations with others, right? And I think that's fundamentally a kind of materialist orientation, right? It's saying that you shouldn't be simply interpreting spirit or interpreting the world. You should be trying to change it in a way that's consistent with the most basic principles of justice. And I think that, I know that actually, since he and I talked about it, that Michael felt very similarly at a lot of points. Now, he was a little bit more inspired by a Taoist or Buddhist tradition than I was, although I know he was interested in various kinds of Christianity as well, people like Cornel West, for example, right? And I'm not very familiar with that. But I think that this spiritual intuition he had, that genuine depth and spiritual depth came from acts, not inner reflection, was something that, we both aligned on.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I guess to bring it back to Galen's work, because even though you weave in his work in a sort of positive light, and you obviously you can just kind of endorse the book that people should go out and read it and stuff like that. You do have a critique of it.
I do.
and you use Kierkegaard to go out and critique this sort of, religion of the heart. And it's a very sophisticated sort of argument that you're making that, there is this sort of bullshit spirituality or self-help type stuff that's out there that we should be, and Zizek has gone out and made that criticism as well. So I was hoping to maybe kind of hear you elaborate a bit about that, like your concern about stuff around religion of the heart or this kind of self-help, human potential, cultural stuff that's very present, particularly within the Anglosphere and particularly in the United States and stuff like that. And, how you kind of take it down with Kierkegaard. I was curious to hear you reflect a bit more on that.
Okay, well, there are a bunch of different elements to your question. I'll try to take them one by one. I should say, though, that if you're interested in that subject matter, I think I develop a much better version of that argument in the new book that I'm writing on the political right and inequality, since there is an extremely long section on Dostoevsky, who I think is far and away the most sophisticated and articulate advocate of the idea that religion is a kind of interiority, that it expresses itself in love, right? And he gives us a very reactionary kind of interpretation. And I use Tolstoy to point out what I think are the most significant problems with that, since I think the only way to beat a great Russian novelist is with an even greater Russian novelist, as it were, right? But the basis of my critique in this book is kind of twofold. One, I say that I think Kierkegaard is absolutely right in arguing that this turn towards liberal individualism wasn't a deviation from Christianity, but a kind of radicalization of this Christian impetus towards interiority that you can see going all the way back to somebody like, say, St. Augustine, or I would argue even Christ himself. If you look at something like the Suffering in Gethsemane, or again, his infamous cry on the cross, where he calls out to God, asking why God is abandoning him. And if you take triune theory seriously, there's something remarkably paradoxical about that, since it's basically God coming to even doubt himself, or at least the aspect of God that's embodied in the Son coming to doubt himself, which is a Zizekian point, right? So once you recognize that Christianity culminates in this kind of interiority, right? You recognize that a lot of the reactionary criticisms about religion and secularization, particularly this notion that Christendom has fallen apart into trite individualism, don't have an awful lot of water to them, right? That actually there's a kind of movement towards the religion of the heart and authenticity and faith, which is immanent within the tradition itself. However, right, I think that there are limitations to this. And one of the limitations that we see with it is that certain kinds of Christianity can very easily be, and spirituality can very easily be commodified, as we see essentially our faith as being best embodied in these highly individualistic enterprises where we just try to give expression to it through consumption and through the most banal kinds of aesthetic representation. And I see a more sincere kind of Christianity and a more sincere kind of religiosity as being one that expresses our individuality through acts and forming meaningful relations with others. And I think this is the basis of this materialist turn that you talked about at the beginning, where we try to affirm the turn towards interiority that Christianity carried out, but regard it as being expressed in an eventual turn of the subject towards the other.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I mean, because one, I'm familiar with Kierkegaard's argument and stuff like that, but having read his work, I mean, obviously, he attacks this cheap cultural Christianity, right? There's that if you're just born into Christendom and stuff like that, doesn't go out and make you a real Christian. And I mean, I was more exposed to William James, and William James talks about the once born and twice born sort of Christian motif, is that, you don't get to go out and be a Christian, or you don't get to, to have a moment of grace without some sort of, trial and tribulation and stuff like that, or even to actually go out and sort of, if you go out and use Christian motif, pick up your own cross type of stuff. So, and I appreciated that, because I was concerned reading Galen's work that there is this sort of cheap spirituality that's out there. So I was really happy to see that critique of that in your writing, and it's super sophisticated. And I think people should go out and read that.
I just wanted to say one thing on what you commented about, which is that people should read Kierkegaard's Attack on Christendom because beyond just being a profound work, it's a remarkable work in the kind of almost Nietzschean way. It makes counterintuitive claims about Christianity and Christian doctrine. Nonetheless, I think have a severe amount of truth to them. And I really mean severe. At one point in the text, he points out that if you truly believe that man's inner relationship to God is the most important thing, there's something extraordinarily duplicitous about yearning for Christendom, because Christendom makes the way to God easy by transforming it into just a bunch of social conventions. And the reason he says that social conservatives want to make the way easy is precisely because their faith is so brittle, right? Unless everyone buys into it, they cannot have faith. And he says, what a kind of mockery of this notion that it's the individual's intense spiritual relationship with God that is supposed to be at the epicenter of their life. The way God shouldn't be made easier, if this is true. The way to God should be made always harder. And so he says it would actually be beneficial to Christianity for a lot of the kind of fluff and nonsense and social conservatism that surrounds it to disappear and for it to be replaced with people who really have to struggle to form this kind of individuated relationship with God. And I think this is also where he differs and where I would actually use him to be critical of these more superficial kinds of New Age spiritualities which have emerged, which take a kind of jargon of authenticity, to use, Adorno's term, and use that to link spirituality to consumption, self-expression, and narcissism, right? There's a kind of bastardization of Kierkegaardian themes that one sees expressed there, but I think it has very little to do with what he was aiming for.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, for sure. So I guess, how do you contrast that with what you're talking about in terms of the, dialectical sort of Christian materialism that you're talking about with Zizek? How do you see that as different from what Kierkegaard? Because I mean, obviously you're thinking of something completely different now that we are in the postmodern sort of era, right? You're even thinking about, how can we actually go out and rethink religion? So you're obviously sympathetic to Kierkegaard's critique in what Christianity is really about. But what do you think is happening to religion in the postmodern era?
Well, I think this is, again, where we need to be dialectical, right? And this is where I take a lot from Galen's work, because I do think the emergence of religious pluralism is something to be celebrated and cherished, right? Precisely because it does allow people to form these individuated relationships to God and to articulate, as Tillich would say, what's of ultimate concern to them in the kind of spiritual grammar that's appropriate to them, right? I think that the flip side of this, or the obverse, is this danger of being captured by the vulgarities of postmodern culture. And for people to take this kind of pluralistic and permissive ethos as an opportunity to just buy into the most crass and venal and banal forms of spirituality out there. And I think if that happens, it will be a tremendous shame. And what we'll see is very much like what Kierkegaard detected in Attack on Christendom, which is a world where many of us claim to be spiritual, and yet no one really cares about God. Now, this is also where I become critical of Kierkegaard in a way that reflects the work of somebody like Zizek and Hagelin. Because as you know, Kierkegaard was very critical of this idea that to live in faith means to adopt an ethical orientation towards the world. And this is because he was very fixated on this idea that a genuine, intense relationship with God is a highly personalized and psychological one, defined by radical interiority. I think that what we need to do as materialist Christians is to argue that radical interiority eventually needs to find expression in our relationship with something else that is also radically interior, but constantly trying to break out of itself, which is the other, right? Which is the world outside of us. And what Zizek and Hagelin start to do, and I think that this is by no means a completed project, is look at different ways that we can start to understand that in a theic language that draws from the Christian tradition. And I think that Zizek's book, The Fragile Absolute, and his dialogue with John Milbank provide the best conceptual resources for such a reinterpretation available thus far. In particular, Zizek's interpretation of the death of God as being a moment of liberation from socially conservative theistic constraints, and an invitation to assume the ethical project of God of trying to create a world of dignity and flourishing for all. Now, Zizek would be the first to say that this is very much a project that's going to take far longer probably than his lifespan and far longer than any of ours, right? This kind of rethinking process. But I think that's, again, in keeping with the history of Christianity and religion generally, where we're talking about millennia-long processes here, nothing that's going to be solved with any degree of satisfaction very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is interesting because through Chris Sator introduced me to Sean McGrath's work, since he's
Chris
pretty
is a great
big
guy. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously, like I've been really interested in his work, and I guess all the excitement around German idealism and how it's kind of coming into the Anglosphere, and a lot of people are jumping on the bandwagon in terms of, obviously attracted to Zizek and stuff like that.
Oh, hey, I'm no different than that. I wrote a paper on Schelling in 2017 because Chris got me into Schelling, right? So yeah.
So, but Sean McGrath has got some pretty scathing critiques of Zizek, that basically he's an atheist, and that his version of Christianity is nothing but some sort of kind of psychological sort of, Lacanian twist to things. So I'm curious to hear you kind of talk a bit more about, like how you see Zizek's work, and whether you think he is some sort of atheist, or, he's not taking Christianity seriously, or this kind of debate between John Milbank and him and stuff like that. I'm curious to hear your thoughts a bit more about that.
Well, this is a fascinating discussion, right? And we'll only be able to scratch the surface of it here, right? But making a long story short, Milbank holds to a kind of radically orthodox version of Christianity. It's probably best defended in his book, Theology and Social Theory, although there's an updated defense of it in his dialogue with Zizek. But long story short, what he makes the argument that there are good reasons why socially conservative variants of Christianity fell apart. And the reason is because they didn't take Christian orthodoxy seriously enough. And this is a point that a lot of radical Orthodox figures get from somebody like Chesterton, for example, right? And he argues that what we need to do is radically rethink St. Thomas Aquinas in particular, right? But also a lot of the other medieval scholastics, and recognize that there is a kind of materialist dimension to that work, but it's one that still holds, from Milbank's perspective, very seriously to this idea of God as a kind of transcendent guarantor of the material universe and all of its different operations, right? Now, how this is to be conceived, I think Milbank would be the first to say that he's still thinking through how to understand such a kind of reconceptualization of the scholastic project, but it's something that they've been doing for a long time. Whereas Zizek's kind of argument is that this notion of there still needing to be a kind of residual theistic guarantor of the material universe is in and of itself still too problematic, since it's essentially postulating a transcendent outside that's the guarantor of meaning, for all of us. And this is, the kind of Lacanian bit of his complete critique. But more than just that, he would argue that this is actually contrary to the Christian message in and of itself, which is, from his perspective, that God died on the cross. And he eventually was resurrected to demonstrate symbolically that with the passing of God, human beings were guaranteed eternal life as the kind of figures through which God's plan would be completely realized or finally realized. And what this symbolically demonstrated was that humankind was given a new kind of freedom to actually be creative and to generate novelty in a way that would be akin to what God was doing before, but with the same kind of ethical responsibilities, even absolute ethical responsibilities, to take charge of our own actions that also come from that, right? And there are precedents to this that you can find in the Christian tradition. Pico Mirandola's Oration on Human Dignity is probably the most important one, but it's a very interesting dialogue. And like I mentioned, I don't think we've seen the last word on it by any measure.
Gotcha. And do you think Milbank would you categorize him? I mean, because obviously he's big time into postmodern theology, but would you consider him to be a postmodern conservative?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's hard to say because he goes through a lot of different transitions, but in Theology and Social Theory, he actually makes an argument for something that would be closer to what we see with the post-liberals now, that he wants to combine a kind of socialist economics or at least the socialist critique of capitalism, with a kind of respect for more conventionally conservative cultural norms, right? Now, he doesn't advance the argument that far in the book, but he does in other kinds of writings. And while I've seen him shy away a little bit from this early embrace of Marxism, or at least elements of Marxism, he's never quite abandoned it entirely, right? There's a reason why it is that he wants to dialogue with people like Zizek, right? Rather than people like, say, Patrick Deneen, for example. And I think that's because there's a sense in which he thinks that a pronounced emancipatory element of the Christian tradition is, and a pronounced ethical element of the Christian tradition is best preserved in a world that's committed to a certain degree of economic equality, right? I think he just demonstrates continuous and understandable wariness of the atheism that he often associates with various left-wing movements.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, no, I mean, and I've seen in some places Ron Dart has written about Milbank in some sort of ways, and apparently Milbank was quite moved and touched by some of George Grant's work. So in terms of viewing him sort of as a sort of, I guess maybe red Tory, I guess you can say. So I was curious to hear a bit more. Well, I mean, just hear whether you would smear him as a sort of postmodern conservatism or try to box him in that way.
No, I mean, I have a lot of respect for Milbank's work. Theology and Social Theory is every bit the masterpiece people claim that it is, right? The part of it that I disagree with is the argument that he puts forward that theology can play the kind of role that Habermas wants philosophy to play, right? As a kind of arbiter between different epistemes. I'm not really sure that he makes the case that theology is the appropriate discipline for playing that role. However, it is very interesting to see him try to carry out such an ambitious project. And there were a lot of very interesting ideas in that book that came out of an attempt to defend this kinds of position. So I have a lot of respect for him. And I have to say, even if he was a postmodern conservative, what you do have to give him credit for is that unlike somebody like Jordan Peterson, when he was dialoguing with Zizek, he actually took the time to very slowly, methodically read over Zizek's books, respond to him point by point, read over Badiou's books since he was in a big influence, respond to Badiou's points bit by bit. So even if I sit there and I tend to side with Zizek in their debate, you have to give a lot of respect to somebody who's willing to do that, right?
Yeah, no, he's definitely got some chops, and compared to Peterson, stuff like that. Okay, but
Yeah.
I mean, I know you're pressed for time too, but I want to maybe just end on this. So, I mean, because you said to Dugan at various times that he's a postmodern conservative, and now, you know, in Commonweal, you came out pretty hardcore swinging, saying that it's, you know, straight up, he's a fascist. So I'm not sure if you changed your mind in terms of, you know, how he fits into what postmodern conservatism is, and now kind of talking about what we're talking about right now in terms of, you know, rethinking religion in a sort of postmodern era. I'm dying to hear just a few of your thoughts on, you know, how, you know, on any of this.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have to say, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, right? I mean, if you want to call him a postmodern fascist or postmodern rightist, maybe that would be a little bit more appropriate. And I would actually think that it's accurate, right? Especially because he leans so heavily into postmodern theory to justify his particular 21st century fascism, right? The reason why I lean so heavily
Milbank or somebody like Caputo isn't?
Sorry?
Somebody like Milbank or Caputo isn't leaning so into postmodern, you know, theory and discourse?
Oh, they most certainly are, right? The difference is that the way that I understand conservatism, and I defend this in my new book, is, or rightism, if you want, is very much the way that Hayek defined it, right? Somebody who's on the political right is committed to the idea that there are demonstrably superior people in any given society, and that they are entitled to superior levels of affluence, status, and political power. And I've just never really seen anything in Milbank's work that suggests he's not committed ultimately, even to a very firm kind of human equality, right? If anything, he tends to make the neo-scholastic argument that the best guarantor of certain kinds of equality is precisely the most profound equality of all, which is the equality of all human beings before God, right? So is he a conservative in some sense? Well, he is a conservative in the sense that he's radically orthodox, right? But I think what he's trying to enact is less a kind of conservative recovery so much as a restorative recovery of the tradition, right? That brings to light the emancipatory potential that he sees as still residing within more classical versions, scholastic versions of Christianity, right? That's very different than what somebody like Alexander Dugin is trying to do through an appeal to postmodern thinking, right? As I laid out in that kind of article, what Dugin is trying to do is to agitate for radical kinds of inequality, both within society and geopolitically. And he's found some tacky ways to try to find postmodern theorists who will allow him to argue this more successfully. For the most part, I find it all profoundly unconvincing, right? But the reason that I characterize him as a fascist is if you read somebody like Roger Griffiths' work, and Roger Griffiths, I think, is the best fascism scholar alive today. Central to the idea of fascism is this notion of palingenetic ultranationalism, this idea that you have an ultra nation, which is the transcendent source of meaning for all the individuals who make it up, and that it needs to be restored because it's been undermined by decadent processes and decadent egalitarianism and materialism. And he very much fits that mold, right? With this idea that the nation-state boundaries of Russia as it exists right now are completely inadequate to its final destiny, that eventually you're going to see a renewed Russian empire that will be aligned with, as I put it, a colorful cabal of white nationalists, other identitarians, and Islamic fundamentalists, and they will eventually confront the dangerous egalitarianism and materialism of the West, and the conflict between them will generate higher and more interesting kinds of politics. And this will be carried out ultimately by authoritarian figures like Dugin and the people that he approves of. And he's very, very insistent about this. I said, in his Heidegger book, he has a charming section where he talks about the swarming masses, comparing human beings beneath him to insects, right? And he says that the real philosopher pays about as much attention to him as to them as he does to any other idle old thing. And the job of the swarming masses isn't to dictate what the philosopher thinks or the kind of projects that the philosopher calls for. Their job is to obey when he calls them to their destiny. And the destiny that Dugin wants to call them to is horrifying. So we should reject it. What did there was a review of Atlas Shrugged that said, this is not a book to be thrown, it is a book to be hurled forcefully. That's the way people should respond to any of Dugin's books.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I haven't seen Milbank specifically. I mean, I've appreciated Milbank to kind of go to town on Patrick Janine at various times. I've seen that kind of happen online and quite critical of some of his work. So I was happy to go out and see that. No, Milbank to me is a really interesting figure.
Yes.
And I'm your whole section in the book, I'd love to talk to you a lot more about that and some, and maybe on a later time and stuff like that. In terms of rethinking religion kind of in the postmodern era, to me is, it's bang on, and I'm so interested in that subject and what what that implies. I feel that you are only sort of scratching the surface of that subject as well. So maybe we can end on that. Is that something you got in the pipeline eventually to go and write a bit more about, or?
Oh, absolutely. And I should say that's not just speculative. Like I said, I have a very, very long section in my new book that's on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, where I wrestle with these kinds of themes even more extensively than we saw in the postmodern book. In terms of whether or not I'm ever going to write a book exclusively on that, I don't have any plans to do that yet, but we'll have to see, right? It's something that I've always wanted to do and something I'm very interested in. It's just, as you know, and has come through, I think, in our conversation, the complexities and the nuances of such a discussion are vast, right? Far vaster than even what would be entailed by just a discussion about things like political ideologies, like fascism or conservatism or whatever, since we're talking now about kind of theological and ontological issues. So that would mean that means I need to spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I wouldn't want to put anything systematic forward unless I had thought it through as comprehensively as I possibly could. Until that day comes, though, I should say that I think not only Zizek's work, but Hagelin's as well, particularly that book, This Life, are great jumping off points for people who are interested in spiritual issues on the left to begin thinking through these kinds of things in a more materialist way that nonetheless pays a lot of credit to the history of religious thought in the West and elsewhere, right?
Rock on.
And
yeah,
it was
no,
really,
for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And it was just really refreshing to see people treat religion that way rather than just do the kind of vulgar Marxist. And I want to stress again, vulgar Marxist thing of dismissing religion as the opiate of the masses or whatever, and then calling it a day.
Yeah. No, perfect. No, I love that. I mean, and I feel that, like every time I've seen your interviews or whatnot and stuff like that, I feel that people don't give you airtime around this. So I really appreciate you giving me time to come back around and, giving you a bit of a platform to talk about this stuff. Because, I mean, every time I hear you do an interview somewhere, I'm like, why aren't they asking him about these other dimensions of his work and stuff like that? Like, I get you're a political scientist and stuff like that, but man, I know that you're just as philosophically and theologically sophisticated, and I think that'd be cool. I mean, this is why I keep circling back around, right? And I keep knocking and being like, "Hey, Matt, I want to talk to you." Like these sections of your books and your writing or what really lighting me up, and that's why I've been following your work since the beginning. I mean, even your book in terms of human dignity. I mean, that book is. Speaks to some of these things on multiple levels as well. And I encourage people to really go out and pick up, if they can, all of your work. So, and rock on that Commonweal piece, man. I'm sure you're pretty excited about that too, man.
Yeah, I was surprised that people seemed as interested in that as thought. But I have to say, I really appreciate you saying that, because it's funny, I just thought about that when you said that. But yeah, nobody does ask me questions about that, which is why I was a bit surprised when you asked me questions about it. Not that, I'm offended by it by any way. It's just I so rarely get asked about it. So I just want to say I really appreciated you having me on. And thank you so much for being attentive to that. It's just nice to have somebody that appreciates that side of what I do.
Yeah. No, I mean, your work with Galen's work, I thought it was a 1-2 punch on to go out and start to hammer some of these, this subject out a bit. There's some other players out there too. And obviously I'm super excited to go out and get my hands on your Cosmopolitan Socialism book, because I have a feeling that, some of those themes might crop up in there too. So yeah, man, to be continued. Rock
Absolutely.
On. I really appreciate your time, and good luck at this other thing you got going tonight too. And I'll be in touch.
Thanks, buddy. Take care of yourself and stay warm, man.
Yeah, you too, man. Peace.
Yeah.